Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Rev Dr Rick Dacey, Senior Minister, Wesley Congregational Life.
What would you say if I told you that there are in our church vegetarians? That's right, actual practicing vegetarians in our church. I myself am not a vegetarian, as you might have guessed by looking at me. I mean, look at me. I'd have to be one serious vegetarian, wouldn't I? But what if I were to tell you that I know for a fact that there are vegetarians in our church? Would you be shocked? Would you be alarmed? Would you be wondering to yourself, oh dear, maybe this is not the church for me? Well, it's true. There are people who take an active, vital role in the life of Wesley Mission, who worship and serve as part of Wesley Mission, who are also vegetarians. That's a fact. So let me say this as clearly as I can. Let me be as plain as I possibly can. To you who are vegetarians, I say this with deep conviction. You belong. You belong. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I say this as a meat eater. To all my vegetarian sisters and brothers, you belong because you belong to Christ. I want to pause the sermon right here because I'm seeing a lot of confused looks and a few rather concerned looks. Why is he going on about vegetarians? Well, it's understandable that you'd be slightly confused and maybe a little bit alarmed. I mean, why wouldn't vegetarians belong? Why would we talk about vegetarians? Because in the 21st century church in Sydney, this is a complete non-issue. Of course there are vegetarians and there are non-vegetarians in the church. So what? What does that have to do with anything? Well, there was a time. There was a time when this was an enormous issue in the church. A very big issue in the church. And when we look at Romans 14, as we have tonight, as we've begun to look at that, we need to understand that this was going on. This was a big issue in the church at that time. The church in Rome, this was a big deal. Paul is writing to the church in Rome, and at that time, the question of vegetarianism was on everyone's mind. Meat eaters. Meat eaters were sneering, contemptuously sneering at vegetarians. And the vegetarians, on their side, they were casting judgment on the meat eaters. Both sides had their biblical and theological rationale, and both sides were convinced that they were in the right. Each group was drawing a circle with people like themselves on the inside of the circle and with others, people who weren't like them on the outside. We in our circle have it right. Those people, them, they have it wrong. The people outside our circle. Yeah, I know it's hard to imagine. I know it's hard to imagine that this could have been such an important issue for people in the church, but for some people, this was huge. Whether to eat meat or not was a really big issue, and emotions were running high. It drove wedges between friends. It divided families. And the arguments and conflict around it sapped energy from the ministry and mission of the church. And it wasn't just the question of whether to eat meat or not. There were a lot of other issues as well that threatened the life of the early church. And we see a couple of these right here in Romans 14. There was the question about celebrating feast days or not. There was the question of drinking alcohol or not. People were using all these issues to draw circles separating us from them, with us inside the circle and them outside. Do you know what it's like? Have you experienced what it's like to be drawn outside the circle? Have you felt what that's like in your life for someone else to draw a circle and count you out? It hurts. It hurts a lot. And I think most of us have experienced it at some time. Some of us may have experienced it most of the time. It really hurts to be excluded, to be counted out. And that's one reason why we are tempted to draw those circles. Because we don't want to be hurt. We want to defend ourselves. You know, if we're the ones drawing the circles, we get to choose who's in the circle. Or if we don't draw the circle ourselves, we might find ourselves as spiritual border guards, walking the borderline, checking people's papers, seeing who belongs in and who should be kept out. They're very human behaviors. And we may have pious, religious justifications for drawing those circles of judgment or guarding the border, judging ourselves who deserves to come in and who needs to be kept out, who needs to be counted out. But however many Bible verses we use to buttress those behaviors, we need to recognize that they flow not from faith, but from fear. That's why we draw those circles. That's why we guard the borders. It's not that the issues that the Romans were talking about, it's not that the issues that they're wrestling about are unimportant to Paul. They are important to Paul. The issues are important. He writes about them elsewhere, in Galatians, for example. He writes very strongly about these issues. But here, the main problem that Paul sees it's not the issue themselves. It's not the issue. The issue is not the issue here. The main problem is how the people of the Roman church are dealing with these issues. People are putting themselves in the judgment seat. And Paul is saying, that's not your seat. You're not allowed to sit there. You need to get out of that seat. You don't get to sit in the judgment seat. Paul addresses this theme elsewhere as well, but here in Romans 14, he hammers away at it, driving the point home. The verb to pass judgment, in Greek it's krino. It appears repeatedly in Romans 14. We see it in Romans 14:3, in Romans 14:4, in Romans 14:5, in Romans 14:10, in Romans 14:13. He wants to make sure we're hearing this. Hear what he says in verse 4. This is wonderful. He says, "Who are you to judge someone else's servant?" I love that. It would be like if I were to go across the street to the Hilton and waltz on into a manager's office and sit down and then start calling the staff in so that I can do performance reviews with them. I can't do that. Those staff, they don't report to me. That's not my office. And Paul is using a similar metaphor here. He's saying that those are not your servants. Those people, those other people in the church, those people who you're drawing out of the circle. Who are you to judge someone else's servant? And Paul, as he spins this out in the verse, this is wonderful. Who are you to judge someone else's servant? To their own master, servants stand or fall. Now hear this. And they will stand. And they will stand, for the Lord is able to make them stand. The judgment of the Lord comes from love, not fear. He's not out looking to trip people up or to catch them out. He's not a gotcha God. The God who is revealed to us in Jesus Christ is not a God who's trying to draw a circle and count people out. He's a God who's pouring himself out to include people in. And he can make them stand. He is able to make them stand. And then in verse 10, you then, why do you judge your brother or sister? Or why do you treat them with contempt? For we all stand before God's judgment seat. Whose judgment seat? See, Paul hammers the theme. Get off that judgment seat. It's not your seat. None of us gets to sit in that seat. Here, verse 13. Therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. Paul knows that judgmentalism has a toxic effect on the church. It strangles a church's ministry, and it stifles a church's missional spirit. Paul needs the church in Rome to be healthy. He has a missional purpose in this. He doesn't want people just to be nice to each other, just get along with each other. No, he needs the church to be the church. He wants to visit the church in Rome, and he wants to have them send him on to Spain to spread the gospel. But he knows that if he shows up in the church in Rome and they are entrenched in fortified circles of exclusion, there is no way that they are going to be able to send him on in mission. And so he's urging them to get off the judgment seat. So there's a lot at stake here. It's not just whether people are going to get along, it's whether the church is going to be able to get on with being the church. 2,000 years later, the church in Sydney is no longer bogged down in squabbles about vegetarianism like the early Roman church. We can thank God for that. But we still need to hear the apostles' admonition, even today, even us. Too many Christians seem to think that God simply can't manage the job of judgment. Oh, yes, it's God's job, but he needs a little help. We can help him along the way. We really should. We feel like maybe God needs a hand with that. I think of Jesus' parable of judgment in Matthew 25. In that parable, Jesus describes the king separating the sheep and the goats. And somehow a lot of Christians from the first century to right up to today seem to have this notion that God isn't quite up to the job. Here, Lord, let me help you out. I've got this clipboard with my little piety checklists, and let me just help you tick some of the boxes here right now. Who's first? Oh, Lord. Oh, this next person, before you decide which way, I mean, it's your decision, Lord, but there are some things you should know about this person. Let me help you out with a little background information on this person. Do you think God needs help? Jesus never gives any indication that God needs anyone's assistance in judgment. In fact, he says clearly in Matthew 7, 1 through 5, Jesus says, "Do not judge, so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye?" And in fact, here's the thing. Look at that parable again, the sheep and the goats, Matthew 25. Who are the ones that Jesus identifies as his sisters and brothers? Who are the ones who Jesus identifies with personally? This is my mob. Whoever does something to one of these people, whenever you do something to one of these people, these, not one of them or those, one of these people, you do it for me. Who are these people? Who are the people that Jesus says, I'm with these people? The hungry and the thirsty, the stranger and the foreigner, the outsider who needs clothes to keep warm, the sick person who has been labeled contagious or unclean, the convicted criminal doing time in prison. All of them are outsiders, people drawn outside of other circles. Them. And Jesus says these outsiders, even the least of these outsiders, they are my insiders. These are my people. I am one of them. And those who want to count them out, those who say to the hungry, you're a drain on our resources. Those who say to the stranger and the foreigner, go back where you came from. Those who say to those who are needing clothes, get a job. Those who say to the sick, unclean, stay away from me, I don't want to catch what you have. Those who say to the prisoner, good riddance, after what you've done, we wash our hands of you. To those who draw that circle and judge themselves in and others out. To who judge themselves deserving and others undeserving. To them, Jesus says this. He says, truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. The one who sits in the judgment seat, the only one who truly has the authority to sit in the judgment seat, says when you count them out of your circle, you count yourself out of my circle. That's what Jesus is saying. I've served some churches in ministry where everyone seems to have it together. You look at them on a Sunday, and they are all nicely dressed. They come in their nice cars from their nice homes, and they come to their nice church with their nice smiles and their nice families, and they sit in their nice pews. Everything all put together. And in serving those churches, I would have a regular stream of people meet with me one-on-one in my office pretty much every week. Most weeks, I would have somebody share with me something like this. I feel like I don't belong in this church. Everybody else is living such a good life, and they have it all together, and I'm falling apart. My life is a mess, and I feel like I just don't belong in church. And I would point out to them, you don't look like you're falling apart. I see you on Sunday, you don't look like your life is a mess. And they tell me, yeah, well, that's just a front, that's just a facade. I put this church face on so that I look like everybody else, so that I'll fit in, and so people won't know that really I don't belong. And then I would let them in on the secret that none of us has it all together. We are all a mess. And the person who was in my office the week before was saying the same thing about them. They saw how put together they looked. They saw the smile on their face, and they thought they didn't belong because the person who's in my office the following week has it all together. And these people are all saying this about each other. And inside, they're all feeling broken and empty and in need. And that's the secret. The truth is, we all belong. Not because we've got ourselves together, but because the Lord has us together. We belong to Christ. We are broken people in need of grace, and He has enough grace for us all. You belong to Christ. You belong to Christ. And this is Paul's word to the people in the Roman church in Romans 14. You belong to Christ. You belong because you belong to Christ. For none of us lives for ourselves alone. And none of us dies for ourselves alone. If we live for the Lord. And if we die for the Lord. So whether we live or whether we die, we belong to the Lord. I thank God that here at Wesley Mission, we're pretty well across that. There aren't a lot of people who are putting on facades here. We know that we are broken people in need of grace. We know who we are. In nearly 4 years of ministry here, I've never heard one person tell me that they feel like they don't belong here because everyone else seems to have it together. We're a little more honest than that. We look at one another and we don't have to pretend. We don't need to play games or put on a nice church face. We look at one another and we know that we are all broken people in need of grace. So if there is anyone who hasn't gotten that message, hear it now. Whoever you are, whatever you have done, wherever your life has led you, you belong here because you belong to Christ. If you're a meat eater or a vegetarian, you belong in this church because this is Christ's church. And we belong to Christ. You belong to Christ. If you're wrestling with addiction, or if you've faced trauma or abuse, or if your sexuality is different than the person next to you, you belong in this church. Because this is Christ's church, and you belong to Christ. If you've cut ethical corners at work or cheated to get ahead in school, if you feel like your life is adrift and meaningless, if you've been selling your body to try and get by, you belong in this church. Because this is Christ's church and you belong to Christ. If you're hungry or thirsty physically or spiritually or in need of clothing to keep warm, if you're a stranger or foreigner who's been displaced, who's been told go back, if you're struggling with physical or mental illness, or if you're wearing a criminal conviction, or if for whatever reason someone else has drawn a circle and counted you out, Christ has drawn a circle of grace and counted you in. Not because you've earned your way in, not because you've fought your way in, but because he has died for you, and by his blood he has bought your way in. You belong here in Wesley Mission because we all belong to Christ. And you belong to Christ. And if you are a border guard, trying to sort out who's in and who's out, hear this: you can stand down. Release your fears, embrace your faith. You can stand down. Don't be afraid. By his grace, Christ has secured a place for you in the circle too. By his grace. You are no one's owner, but you are your brother's keeper. You are your sister's keeper. You have no right to judge, but you have a calling to love and to serve and to care because you belong to Christ. We belong to Christ. Thanks be to God.